Ernest Thompson Seton was one of the founders of the Boy Scouts of America. He was a naturalist. He was a painter. He had a youth group of his own with several thousand boys in it. And when the Boy Scouts idea was brought, when he folded his group into the Boy Scouts, he was the first chief scout executive of the Boy Scouts. And he also was a great speaker, I understand. And his wife wrote a book. Her name was Julia. It listed all the stories that he had in it. And it's called Campfire and Trail Stories by Julia Seton. And my favorite story in there is one of Gorham, the giant of the ford. In the year 325 AD, they held a big meeting, a conference of all the leaders of the church at that time. And for many weeks, they discussed all the doctrines and many different ideas. And for instance, some thought were not important at all. How many angels can dance on the point of a needle? Or if man's soul is, part of his soul is in his hair, what happens if he becomes bald? After many weeks of this debate, a monk from the North Country stood up, and he gave his views in the form of this story. He said in the North Country there was a farmer who farmed many acres of land, and he had many herds and many flocks and many row crops, and he had a lot of men working on his farm. Of course, they lived there too. But his father was the biggest boss, and he had one son. His name was Gorham, and his wife had died when Gorham was a baby, and Gorham was quite a big boy. And in fact, by the time he was 12 years old, he was 6 feet tall, and he was proud of his size and his strength. He's a big muscular kid too, but most of all, he was proud that his father was the big boss around there. And by the time he got 16, he was 12 feet tall. And a giant man. His father, sometimes when some of the men started loafing, he said, go over there and see if you can get them back to work. But when they saw him coming, they got up and got busy. And then one day, Gorham came in and found his father all distressed and all upset. And he said, what is it, Father? He said, are some of the men loafing? Do I need to go shake them up a little bit? He said, no. He said, Gorham, it seems I've gotten in bad with the king, and I'm afraid he's going to put me off this farm. Gorham said, what do you mean? You're the big boss around here. Nobody can put you off this farm. He said, oh, yes, it's the king. He's over all the farms and all the land. Gorham said, look, I'm the biggest man in this land, and I'll not serve anybody but the biggest boss. So he left his dad. His dad tried to stop him, but off he went. And he made his way down. He saw a big castle up there, and he walked up to the castle gate there, across the moat, across the drawbridge, banged on the door. The guard peeped through the door, cracked in and said, what do you want? He said, I want to work for the king. I want to serve the king. I'm the biggest man in the land, and he's the big boss, and I want to work for him. So the guard came in and went in and talked to the king and said, there's a giant out here and says he wants to serve you. And the king said, well, bring him in, but guard him carefully. So between two rows of guards with their pikes drawn, they led him in to where the king was. And Gorham said, I understand you're the big boss around here. He said, well, yeah, I am. I said, yeah. He said, I'd like to go to work for you. The king said, yeah, I'm sure you're a big fellow like you. So he made him a guard. And so the next few years, he just kept eating and growing, and he didn't have much to do because there wasn't much garden to do around him. And during that period of time, he took him a big log and he made himself a big club. And then one day, 3 or 4 years later, someone came rushing into where the king was and said, their pirates are landing in our bay down here, and they're coming in their small boats to sack the town. So what must we do? The king said, well, call Gorham. He said, he'll know. So he brought Gorham in and said, Gorham, get organized and get all the troops together and go down there and defend our breaches. Gorham said, I don't need any help. I'll take care of this. So he put on a suit of armor to keep their arrows from puncturing. And he picked up his big club and he waded off that down in the water there where they're rowing in. And he pow, 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 sank all their little boats, and a few were swimming around. He got them too. Then he waded on out to where the bigger boats were at anchor. And he reached way down up under the hull and shoved that big club up, and down they went. I mean, he killed them all. Walked back up on the shore there, and everybody was cheering him. He was our hero. Gorham's our hero. Yay! Well, things went along there for a long time after that. And one day he went in to get his order one morning, and the king was all distressed. And he said, "Oh," Gorham said, "What is it, sire?" I said, "Are there more pirates coming?" "No, I'll take care of it. Don't worry about it." He said, "No, it's you wouldn't understand." He said, "Oh, look, try to help me understand. I want to understand." He said, Gorham said, "The treasury is empty. I hadn't paid the troops in a long time, and I dare not tax the people anymore. We'll have a rebellion on that." I said, "That just the whole country has just gone to the devil." "The devil? Who's the devil?" The king said, "I hope you never meet him." He said, "Are you afraid of him?" He said, "Sure, everybody's afraid of the devil. If you're afraid of him, then you're not the big boss. That devil must be." So he stormed out of the castle with his club, but he was in a foul mood, and everybody saw him coming. They got out of his way. But one day he was walking along the road there, and he met a fellow reading a book. A long black robe on, had a shovel hat on it, and Gorham just stood still and let the little guy walk up to him. He said, "Hello." Gorham said, "Would you tell me where I can find the devil?" The devil said, "You'll not find him out here in the country. The devil lives in town. And if you go down on close to the water in the red light district, down at the end of the street there, you'll find a building with swinging doors on it, and that's his headquarters. That's where they serve the strong drink there." So Gorham went down to town, and down in the red light district, and down at the end of the street, sure enough, there had a saloon over it, or whatever name they had for him back in those days. But he peeped in low and saw this strange-looking fellow sitting at a table there, had a little horn sticking out of his head, and looked like a snake or something wrapped around his chair leg. Gorham said, and when the devil looked at him, he could see those evil eyes just glowing. He figured he knew he'd found the devil. Gorham said, "I understand you're the big boss around here, and everybody's afraid of you." He said, "You bet you they are." He said, "Look, I'm the biggest man in this land. I'm going to serve the biggest boss, and I'm going to go to service you." And they'll say, "Well, I'm sure you're a big fellow like you." Say, "Come on." So they went out and they tore up the whole town. They walked over the hill, they tore up another town. And they walked along this trail, and up on top of the hill there was a small building, had a long sloping roof, and had a square tower in the front of it. And on top of the tower, there's a stick sticking upright, and another stick sticking across. And Gorham said, "I'll get this with one swing of my club," and he drew back, and the devil said, No, leave that alone. No. And Gorham looked at him and said, "You're shaking. What's the matter?" He said, "That's the house of the King of Kings." He said, "Are you afraid of him?" "No, come on, let's get away from here now. Don't mess with the king." He said, "You're not the biggest boss. The King of Kings is." So he left the devil. Again, he was in a foul mood. Everybody saw him coming. They ran and hid. They didn't want anything to do with him. And one day he was walking down this long slope toward the river there. And he met a child coming up. And the child walked up to him and Gorham said, "Could you tell me where I could find the King of Kings?" And the child said, "Well, he crossed the river down here at the ford one time. And he said he'd come again, so I'm sure if you go there and wait for him, he'll come again and you'll meet him. So Gorham went on down there, sat down on the edge of the river, and a little while later, old lady came across, and she was just, the water was up a little bit. She was a little afraid to get in the water, and she was carrying a grocery basket, and she said, "Would someone help an old lady across the stream?" So Gorham hopped up and waded across and picked her up like you pick up a child. I mean, he was like 16 feet tall now. He was huge. And so he carried her across and set her gently on the ground, on the bank. And she said, "I don't have any money to pay you with, but I've got an extra dozen eggs. You know, would you care for those?" He said, "Thank you, ma'am. That will help a lot." And so he ate that for supper that night. And next day, he just slept right there on the bank. And next day, he was waking to hear a teamster coming down the hill on the other side. Had a load of grain in his wagon, a couple of mules pulling it. And he got out of the midstream, and he hits quicksand, and the wagon started to sink, and the mule was having trouble. And he help, would someone please help me? And so Gorham hopped up and went down there and easily pulled the wagon and the rig all up. And the wagon master said, "Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you very much." And "Look, I don't have any money to pay you. I've got a sack of oatmeal here. Would you like to have that?" And he said, "Oh, that would do what that would be fine." So he lived off that for about a week, and then word got around there was a giant there that would help you at this ford. So this was a safe ford to cross the river. So more and more people started using this ford. And he'd always help anybody. We never asked for anybody for money, but they would leave him things to support him and help him. So fall came on, and he built him a little cabin right by the ford there. And even through the winter months, he would help people get across the river when they needed it. And so anyway, 5 years went by, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years passed. And he never asked anyone for money or anything, but he was always help anyone who needed help. And one night, it's been the worst winter it ever been. There'd been storms and snow and ice, and the river had been frozen and thawed and frozen again and thawed again. And one night he was in bed, way deep in the night, and he heard a knock on his door. And he was no longer the big, strong giant as before, but he was tottering, an old man. So he had to use his club as a walking stick to get to the door, and he opened the door, and the wind blew in the door, snow blowing in. And he looked down, and there was a child. And he looked at the child, and something in his memory, he couldn't figure out exactly what it was. But then he looked down at the child, and the child said, "Gorham, would you take me across the river tonight? I must get across tonight." So all those years of helping people, never asking for anything in return, and never refusing help to anyone who needed help. He got up, and they walked on down the edge of the river, and he had to use his club to break the shore ice before he could step into the water. He picked the child up and put him on his shoulder, and out they went. And the water was up now. It had been a lot of flooding, and the ice chunks were coming down and hitting him. He had to use the club to brace himself. And when they got out of midstream, the child had to stand up on his shoulders and hold on to his hair to keep him being swept away by the flood. It was just his neck deep on him. But he kept on going. And with his last ounce of strength, he finally reached the other shore and had to use the club to break the ice again. He reached up and he grabbed a willow tree and began to lift himself up the shore. But the child stepped from his shoulders and turned him, faced him. But it was not a child now. It was a full-grown man, a beautiful man. And he looked. And when he saw his beautiful eyes, he said he knew he'd found the King of Kings. So he fell at the master's feet. He said, "Oh my God, all these years I've wanted to meet you, wanted to serve you. And now I'm old and I can't, and I even feel my life ebbing away at this point." And he lay there sobbing. And the master put his hand on it and said, no, boy. He said, I've been watching you all these years. Whenever you carried the sick, the old, the poor across this river, you were serving me. He said, I've been watching you. I have been preparing blessings for you. And I said, I want you to come with me now and live in the palace of the king. And your name will be blazoned on the heavens. You will no longer be known as Gorham of the club or the giant at the ford, but from this day forward, you will be St. Christopher, the giant who carried the Christ child.